I'm Glenn Campbell. I call myself a demographic philosopher. I'm looking at life and trying to predict the future through the lens of demography, or the study of human populations. And today I want to talk about the conflict between baby boomers and millennials. This is a popular meme these days where the two groups are going at each other and have frustrations with each other, and I want to explain why that is demographically. So how do we define a millennial and a baby boomer? Only the baby boomers are clearly defined. This is the generation that was born right after World War II. So World War II was the thing that enveloped the whole world. Every country in the world was engaged in one way or another in World War II, and it sapped a lot of resources. It killed a lot of people. But it was over. By 1945, it was over. In America, the GIs came home. They married their sweethearts, and they made a lot of babies. And this same process was repeated in many countries all over the world. So we had this great baby boom after the war. It started on a very clear year, 1946, because the war was over in the middle of 1945, and it takes 9 months to make a baby. So the first baby boomers didn't show up until 1946. And it ended at a somewhat vaguer year. It's generally accepted around 1964 was the end of the baby boom. And that's when birth rates fell. So at the peak of the baby boom, the average woman in America was having about three and a half babies, 3.5 to 4 babies each, which is a huge number of babies. It means that for every woman who had no babies, there's someone who's having 6 or 7 babies. And the proportion was similar in many other countries. In the 1960s, birth control became available. And by 1964, the birth rate was dropping, and it has been more or less dropping ever since. So the baby boomers are defined as being born between 1946 and 1964. I happen to be a baby boomer. I'm not necessarily proud of it. I don't see myself as a baby boomer. I don't have many of the features of baby boomers. It's kind of unfair to classify people by their year of birth, just like it's unfair to classify them by their skin color or their astrological signs. But statistically, the baby boomers experienced a different kind of environment than later generations, and this shapes their worldview and their economic profile. Now, millennials are not so clearly defined. It's just generally the people who came of age at the turn of the millennium. And that means they were born roughly between 1980 and 1994. That's the generally accepted definition. So these people, the millennials, are full adults now, because the youngest millennial would be about 25 right now. If you're born 1994, you'd be about 25 now. And if you're born in 1980, you're going to be 39 in 2019. So these are the people who are in the prime of adulthood. And it turns out the parents of the millennials are the baby boomers. So the baby boomers had access to birth control. They didn't have as many babies as their parents did, but they did have babies, and these are the millennials. Now, the millennials are very frustrated right now with the baby boomers, because the baby boomers have accumulated a lot of wealth that they're not sharing with the millennials. The oldest, born in 1946, would have reached age 65 in 2011, so he or she is retiring now, and they are now in the full swing of retiring en masse. And the problem with this is that they've been given great promises, both implicit and explicit promises, about how they're going to be cared for in their retirement. And the burden of their retirement is now beginning to fall on the millennials. So the millennials are paying taxes, but the bulk of those taxes are going to the baby boomers. So if you pay Social Security taxes, the bulk of that tax is going to your elders and not to you. So the millennials are paying the bills of the baby boomers. And since there were fewer millennials, proportionally fewer millennials and more baby boomers, there are more expenses to pay for the baby boomers. So, what's it like to be a baby boomer? And my memories of growing up in the suburbs of Boston is that there were a lot of kids around. There were a lot of kids in my family. I was in a family of 4 boys. Everyone in my neighborhood, all the neighbors had huge families. A neighbor next to mine had 6 kids, and another neighbor had 7 kids. So there were a lot of kids around. And even if you happened to be an only child, when you went to school, there were a lot of kids around. So in my suburban community, there were 4 elementary schools, and these elementary schools were packed with big classroom size. There could be between 30 and 40 kids in one classroom. There was a lack of classrooms, so they were building classrooms madly. Some schools would have split sessions where they had some kids come to school in the morning and other kids come to school in the afternoon. It was a big challenge educating everybody. Today, in the same community with the same population, there are only 2 elementary schools, and the class sizes are quite reasonable, 18 to 20 kids in one classroom. So that's the difference between the baby boom and later generations in my hometown. At the same time, because there's so many kids, you didn't get a lot of parental attention. We were basically free-range kids. We could go where we wanted, do what we wanted. I could go for a 100-mile bike ride, and my parents might not even know about it. I could do a lot of things. I had a lot of freedom, but not much of parental attention. No one really cared much about me because the parents were all preoccupied with just survival and keeping this brood around. So in terms of parental attention, we kind of got the shaft. The baby boomers didn't really get a lot of attention. You could say that builds character. We were just one in a great mass of people. But as we grew up and entered adulthood, we baby boomers powered a period of great prosperity. After the war, we had a lot of babies. Those babies initially just lived in houses with their parents, but eventually they got older and had to have apartments and houses of their own, and these things had to be built. So the period between the 1970s up until the early 2000s were a period of great expansion. We're building all sorts of things, building shopping malls and vast new residential sections and new apartment buildings. This was a period of great growth and relative prosperity. Not everyone shared in the prosperity, but on a whole, it was a period of great economic wealth. And the millennials were born into this because when the baby boomers had children, they didn't have as many children. They might have 1 or 2 kids, and they devoted a lot more attention to those kids and were worried more about their safety. There weren't any free-range kids anymore. Parents kept tabs on their kids and protected their kids. And this was the birth of the phenomenon known as the helicopter parents, the parents who are always hovering over their kids and making sure everything is just right. And that's the environment the millennials grew up in. They were cherished children. They were precious. They were precious little princes and princesses, which colored their worldview. And the only trouble with being a prince or princess is that eventually you have to leave your parents, leave your household, and realize that you're not the center of the world anymore, that you're just one cog in the machine. And this is harder for the millennials because they had this cherished upbringing than it was for the baby boomers who were just cogs in the machine to begin with. So right there you have a source of frustration, the frustration of the boomers with the millennials. And the boomers see the millennials as snowflakes, as precious, spoiled children who expect everything to be provided for them. But of course, millennials have reasonable grievances as well. Their elders have taken up all the resources. The elders have nice houses. They have big mansions. The elders have good pension plans and all sorts of benefits that the government is giving them. And the burden is falling on the millennials to pay for all of that. most of the political power in the world now rests with the baby boomers. So the oldest millennial is only 39 years old. They haven't had enough time to really accumulate a lot of political power. Most of the politicians who are representing the millennials are baby boomers. They're in their 50s and 60s because that's how long it takes to accumulate political and economic power. So you have older people making decisions for younger people, even though the older people aren't going to be around for very long. So they only have to worry about keeping the world running for the next 20 years, whereas the millennials have a lot longer to live. They have a greater stake in the long-term future of the world, yet they have limited power. And this boils down in a very practical way to issues around pensions and elder care. Politically, the baby boomers don't want to do anything that's going to diminish their pensions or their entitlements in the future. If you know you're going to get Social Security in a few years, you're not going to hire any politician who threatens to cut your Social Security payments. As a voter, the baby boomer wants to protect above all his entitlements, the things that are going to keep him alive in his retirement. And that's his main concern. He isn't really concerned about what happens after his retirement because then he's dead. He just wants to hold on to whatever was promised to him. And he sees these things as his due, that he's paid into a pension system. He is paid into Social Security and to Medicare. He just expects his payment to be remunerated in the end. He expects to be paid back for his investment by getting a pension and by getting a Social Security and these other entitlements. This to him is very reasonable. Unfortunately, the government has already spent all the money that has been paid in, and pensions systems by and large are underfunded. So ultimately, there aren't enough resources to pay for all these entitlements, and the people who are going to be saddled with this burden of paying for these entitlements are the millennials, the people who are actually paying taxes right now. And the baby boomers have reason to be frustrated because they were made a lot of promises that can't come true. The promises, for example, for these ample pension plans and Social Security plans were based on the previous generation, the generation before the baby boom. When those people got old, we were in the middle of the great boom of the late 20th century, and it seemed okay to offer them these generous benefits. The stock markets were rising, so pension plans were very rich. So it seemed reasonable in the last quarter of the 20th century to make a lot of promises to people, promises about pensions, and the implied promise that things were always going to grow and things were always going to get better. When the boomers see that this isn't happening, that their lives aren't getting better as they get older, they get frustrated. And this frustration boils over into the political realm, where they desperately want to go back to the old days. To them, they look back on the last quarter of the 20th century, and that seems like the best of all possible worlds. So they want to go back there, and they try to vote for politicians who promise to bring them back there. And that's the rise of these boomer-fueled populist movements. Donald Trump, for example, was elected not by the millennials, he was elected by the baby boomers. And the boomers are frustrated, and they thought that this guy was going to save them. That in turn gets the millennials frustrated because they see this charlatan Donald Trump taking over the world based on the votes of these older idiot voters. So you can see how there's plenty of blame to spread around. Everybody's frustrated with everyone else, but the fact is there's just a smaller pool of money to work with. We don't have the boom days that we used to have because the boomers are retiring, so there's a smaller pool of money to work with, and everybody is frustrated by the lack of resources. The baby boomers will say, well, look at all these rights you have. You have gender equality, and you have racial equality, and you have access to birth control, and all of those things are things that the baby boomers fought for. So why do you, the millennials, have a grievance with us? We set up this world for you. We created this good world for you. Why are you frustrated with us? And the millennials say, why should I be paying for your benefits? Why should I be paying for your cushy retirement? when I'm just working my ass off. And millennials have a lot of debts. When I went to college, I had some student loans, but they weren't huge, and I managed to pay them off fairly quickly. Millennials have much bigger college debts because we're not in the same period of prosperity that the boomers experienced. Their jobs aren't as well paying. They are struggling to get by, and they see these old people as a burden. And if there was a revolution today, if there could be a revolution, it would be a revolution of the young people against the old people, because each of them sees the other as the villain here, when the real villain is demography, is just the way things have turned out because of the changes in population. The boomers got to experience the population boom, which was accompanied by an economic boom. And the millennials have to experience the population collapse, the baby bust, and the loss of economic. So what's happening in the millennial era, in their adulthood, is things are shrinking. It's not like building houses and building things and expanding things. The millennials are seeing and will continue to see a contraction, an economic contraction, eventually an economic crash when all of these bills come due. And they blame it on the boomers, but it's nobody really to blame. It's just what happens when a boom crests. So even though the baby boom ended in 1964, the baby boomers didn't go away. They were a big bulge in the population that powered huge economic boom for many decades after the baby boom. But that benefit is running out now that they are retiring. They're not generating economic output anymore. They're not paying taxes anymore. They're just a drain on society. That's not their fault. Individually, they didn't understand what was happening, and it's unfair of the millennials to blame them individually for this. This is just the way things are, that there has to be a collapse now because the boom has ended, and the boomers have shifted from being an asset to society to a liability to society. So how are the millennials responding to this collapse? Well, they're doing it in the logical way. They're not having babies. A millennial may want to have a baby, but all the circumstances aren't very good for it right now because their career is unsecure. They have a lot of debts. They realize, I don't want to bring a baby into this situation. I can barely support myself. Why should I bring a child into this situation? And that would be cruel to the child as well as cruel to me. So the millennials are not having babies. The baby boomers had babies. They just had fewer of them. And the millennials, to a large extent, don't want babies at all. And that's the reason that the birth rate is falling. That among millennials, these are the people who are in the prime childbearing years right now, ages 25 to 39, and they're not having babies. And you've heard of this birth strike movement where people are deliberately not having babies until we fix the environment. Well, the millennials are having a de facto birth strike movement, even without being organized, because each individual millennial is looking at his bank balance and his situation and realizing that, yes, I'd like to have babies, but I can't afford it. Society isn't going to support me because I know society is all focused on supporting the old people. They aren't giving me many services to raise my baby, so I'm doing the logical thing. I'm not having babies. And what that means is that 20 years from now, you don't have the workers to support your society. So 20 years from now, we'll be in the same situation all over again, where the millennials are in the position of the baby boomers, where they are retiring and they're expecting to be taken care of in their old age, yet they haven't produced the babies that are necessary to pay the taxes to support their retirement. So what we're guaranteeing here is just this continuous conflict between the ages, where you always have the young people pitted against the old people. Another thing that the baby boomers have done to the millennials is they have saddled the millennials with government debt. So if you're a politician, if you're a baby boomer politician, you realize that You need to save the majority of your voters are old people who want to save their pensions. So it's in your best interest to try to save Social Security and Medicare and other entitlements for old people. And you don't care too much about what happens 10 years from now because you just want to get reelected. And the logical thing for politicians to do in that case is to spend more money and borrow more money so they can spend more money. And that's what they're doing. And government debt around the world is growing at an enormous pace. And that essentially is a tax on young people, a tax on millennials, and a tax on all the generations that follow. So either the government is going to somehow pay back all these huge debts, or the government has to default on these debts. And I'm betting that the government at some point is going to default on these debts, and this will result in a massive worldwide crash. And the burden of this crash is going to fall on the younger generations because they have to live through it, whereas the baby boomers are going to naturally die anyway, and they just care about, am I going to get my entitlements for the next few years? So that's the only way out, is some big crash where things collapse in such a way that there's a lot of suffering, things don't work, the pension system stops working. If there's a big stock market crash, pension systems are going to be screwed because the pension systems are engaged in all sorts of dodgy investments, trying to make the money they need to pay their future retirees. Everybody's going to be screwed. From top to bottom, everybody's going to be screwed when the big crash happens. And that gives society a chance to reorganize in some way. One way or another, there's going to be a great restructuring where a lot of debts come due and a lot of assets just vanish from the earth. And don't worry, everybody's going to be screwed. The baby boomers are going to be screwed. The millennials are going to be screwed. And we just have to pick up the pieces and try to restart things from scratch.